Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Serious, what's your ghost story?
I was around 10 years old and living in San Antonio. I got back to the apartment first after school. About 5 minutes of being in the place alone, I saw on the reflection of a mirror an older man in a tuxedo was in the kitchen. I flipped out and ran to my room and grabbed a bat. I waited 10-ish minutes before coming out. I locked the door when I got home and never heard the door open for someone to leave. I didn't tell anyone about it. Fast forward 6 years. I was watching Ghost Hunters with my family, and my mom asked if I remember the old man in the tuxedo. Crazy stuff. My dad's story, not mine. Early 1980s, he is working a summer job at Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. One day, he and his friend Mark hiked up to the top of one of the mountains. They set up their tent inside an Indian pit, a manufactured hole dug out by Native Americans hundreds of years ago. The Indian pits were either used as hunting blinds or spots where young braves came to for their vision quest. Late in the night, my dad wakes up and has to use the bathroom. Number one, he crawled out of the tent, out of the pit, and went walking a respectable distance away from the tent. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder pull him backwards. My dad calls out, "Hey Mark, what are you doing?" He turns around, turns on his flashlight, and there is nobody there. He shines the light at his feet and discovers that his next couple steps would have taken him directly over a steep cliff. He did his business and hurried back to the tent. The next morning, the two friends are waking up, and his friend says to him, "I know this sounds crazy, but I woke up in the middle of the night, and I swear to you, there was an Indian man standing outside our tent. Whatever really happened that night, my dad is alive, he met my mom in Yellowstone, and here I am authoring this story to you today." I stayed at my grandmother's house, where my father spent a large amount of time as a kid. My father drove us there in one go and was understandably tired after a 17-hour drive. We all started to lay down, and my father checked in on us before going to bed himself. As he was talking, he stopped himself and told us to cover a large mirror, or you will have nightmares. Now, nightmares from a mirror of all things sound like a little fun to me, but my brothers, who were also sleeping in the same room, asked me to cover it. I did. I asked my dad about it before he left, and he said ghosts use it as an entryway. A week later, I brought it up with my grandmother, and she scoffed, saying, "Oh, this house is not haunted." I agreed, but told her that the reason I brought it up was because my dad told me to cover the mirror. My grandmother then changed her expression and said, "OH, the mirrors?" Apparently, that mirror came from her grandmother. She worked as a nurse and took in those who were going to die, but could not pay for care on their last days. So, she made her home into a hospice. Those who stayed in the room with the mirror saw things. A lovely old lady saw and heard a young lady come into her room and played a harp. She was thankful for the lovely songs, but no one was known nor was a harp owned or heard elsewhere. A young boy found an older boy who played games with him and really knew his games. Lastly, a terrible woman saw, and this is her words, the devil that spat fire at her. The police were called, and she tried to accuse the nurse of trying to kill her with the devil. I also got stories from my mother seeing the same young lady who played the harp without her harp that time, and my grandfather seeing the devil guy. My grandfather described it as a red man with horns that was too tall for the room he was in, so he, still standing up straight, bent his neck down to fit. It stared at him and simply asked slowly, "Why are you here?" I kept that mirror covered. When I was in 5th grade, I forgot to put my school uniform in the laundry basket, so the next day I needed it for school. It was dirty. I went to have breakfast in my pajamas while I was thinking how to tell my mom I didn't have my uniform clean. When I came back to my room, there was a woman I have never seen before, in her 40s, brown dress, dark hair, ironing my uniform. I blinked, and she was gone. I would have assumed I hallucinated the whole thing, but my uniform was there, clean, dried, and ironed and ready for me to use. And it couldn't have been ironed by anyone else because my parents had breakfast with me, and my sister was a baby. From the time I was about 12 to 17 years old, I lived in what I believe was a haunted house. I've never had experiences like I had in that house since moving out. A few specific memories come to mind. Once I was hanging up laundry in my closet. I heard someone whisper my name in my ear, clear as day. I never sprinted out of a room so fast. Another time my sister and I had friends over, and we decided to use a tape recorded to ask questions to the ghosts like they do on those paranormal shows. We played on the tape, not expecting to hear anything, and could hear an incredibly soft voice say, "I'm in the closet." We were sitting near a small closet in the basement. My parents eventually decided to sell the house. We moved into a new place before selling this place. My sister stopped by the house after there had been a couple of showers showing the lights in the house. She went to turn off the lights in the basement, which had multiple light switches. One was at the far end of the basement away from the stairs. She turned off the light and swore she heard heavy footfalls of someone running towards her. She ran out of the house without turning out the rest of the lights and locked the door. That was the last time either of us went back until we were in the neighborhood, and the new owners offered to show us the renovations they made. Nothing happened then, but they did ask us if we wanted to babysit their kids. We politely declined. Similar experience for me in that my childhood home was very haunted, but after moving out of that place, I have had virtually no paranormal experiences at all. None for at least a good 15 years now. Some of the things that happened at that house. Old man ghost walking down the corridor was seen to be at least 5 people, including myself, over the years. Crying baby ghost in a bedroom. Heard by many, but never seen. Distressed lady in a nightgown holding a crying baby at the top of the landing. See by one of my brother's friends. Shadow of a lady in a nightgown whisking past the landing. Ghost of a lady in a nightgown in the garden in the early hours. Strange lights in the cellar. Got pushed down the cellar stairs by nobody. The rustle and swish of garments and the sound of footsteps as somebody wandered around the house at night. Heard by many to the present day, including my brother's girlfriend, who has since refused to ever spend a night at the house again. Generally gripping sense of unexplainable dread and terror, sometimes as you enter some rooms. Dogs apparently see ghosts and get terribly upset by them, growling, barking, and then shaking. Unexplained smells, rooms suddenly flooded with the scent of strong perfume, which then disappears without trace. Chairs and other furniture are sometimes being moved around at night. The sound of a car dramatically pulling up in the gravel driveway at night, only for no car to be seen. One time my nanny, a strict no-nonsense East Side former GDR German lady, was standing by my bedroom window when it happened, and she peeked through the curtains to see who it was, and I saw her freeze. When I asked her what she had seen, she turned her face to me, and she looked terrified, white as a sheet, and refused to tell me what she had seen. One time I was by the window myself when it happened, and I saw what I swear was my father's car sitting there in the driveway, but my dad had died many years ago, and there was no one in the car, and when I stepped away from the window for a moment and looked back, the car was gone. Saw some sort of entity in a field at night, which completely freaked the dogs, 2 guard dogs I was walking out. The creature was following us and was not afraid of us and had eyes like nothing that I saw before. I wondered if I saw a big, escaped cat like a panther, but I had no idea. It certainly terrified the dogs, though. I live in England, and months later my brother got stalked by the same animal along the same stretch of tracks at night and had to run back home, etc. Also, while paranormal activity in the house would sometimes go through incredibly quiet periods, if you altered anything about the house's structure or appearance, it would upset the ghosts a lot and send paranormal activity through the roof. The worst time was when my mom wanted to do a lot of extension work in the house, lots of knocking through walls. We found some pretty freaky stuff, lots of old superstitious witchcraft stuff, such as the remains of sacrificed cats in bricked-up walls and fireplaces, left shoes buried under door frames, apparently stops evil setting a foot in a house, pagan/Christian carpentry marks, the interlocking double V symbols of the Virgin Mary, etc. There was also a lot of evidence of witchcraft in the broader area. Once even found a silver bullet when I was a kid that was at least a few hundred years old, which was very rural and isolated, scattered tiny villages, loads of farmland, very agricultural-based economies, even at the turn of the 20th century, virtually no light pollution at night. Many people living alone by themselves or in small families on isolated farms. The paranormal activity scared me a lot, But my mom was for the most part pretty brave in the face of it. Her policy was largely just to ignore it. I was told a few chants to tell ghosts to get them to calm down if things got bad. But every now and then things would get unbelievably bad in the house, and so the local vicar would be called in to perform an exorcism, quite something to see in real life. Vicar wore special regalia and brought apprentices with him. Lots of special prayers, shaking around of holy water and incense, etc. But while the exorcisms always put a stop to the paranormal activity, it only ever worked as a temporary fix. The most it ever did was stop it for about 3 years. I was so glad for these reasons and more when I managed to move out of that house, and there is literally no amount of money you pay me to spend a night there by myself. I used to sell HVAC in Michigan during college. There was this really awesome old man that called for a new high-efficiency furnace in his historic home in Depot Town, near Ann Arbor. As I'm putting together the quote, we start talking about the home and its history. He tells me that it was part of the Underground Railroad and had a tunnel that led down to the train station, only about 500 yards away. I'll be honest, I was more focused on the sale than all the details he was laying out about the house. But one thing that made my ears perk up was the people that lived with him. He tells me about a few, but the one that stuck out was he said that there was a lady that was so fascinated with electricity that she would turn random lights on at random times. As I print out the quote and go over the details and payment options with him, the light behind me turns on, then the one across the room, then the one in the kitchen, then the one in the hallway. I just kind of got quiet and sunk a little in the seat. Then the old man raised his voice and said something like, "Okay, that's enough for today, sweetheart. We can do it again tomorrow." To this day, I don't know if the old man was just having some fun with me or if it was real. Side note, I closed the sale, and the install team said there wasn't anything too wonky or out of the norm with his electricity. Years ago, 2 friends and I were camping in fall in a small tent, staggered with 2 of our heads on one side and one on the other. It was a silent and still night with fog developing in the moist PNW woods. What sounds like a muffled voice on a cell phone start coming out from the center of the tent between all our heads. I heard someone keep asking, "Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?" My friend asks, "Are you hearing that?" At once we all sat up and started shuffling around in the tent looking for the phone. There is no phone in the tent. I looked at my friend on the other side of the tent and asked what they heard. It sounded like someone saying, "Hello? Can you hear me?" We all agree this is what we heard, and that the sound was coming from the other side of the tent. The next morning, we find all our cell phones sitting in the car still, and there's no cell reception at the campground. Still sends shivers up my spine. This one time when I was little, I was lying in bed with my right ear buried in my pillow. I am suddenly jolted awake by this roar that sounded like it was going directly into my right ear. I woke up startled and confused and began scanning my room for anything as my mind was almost full panic mode. When I looked to my right, I saw this little boy standing next to me. He was glowing blue, but that wasn't the first thing I noticed about him, actually. He looked sad, and I remember feeling bad for him. After a minute, I tried to lean closer to him and even muttered out a faint, "Hey," but as I did, he disappeared. A few days later, I told this story to my mother, who then informed me that the people who owned the house before us had a son who he had when he was 5 in a car accident. However, it wasn't near the house. I should also note now that our house has been renovated since we moved in, and a second floor was added. My current theory is that the boy finally found his way back home and realized that his old home was gone. He came to me because I was the new boy in the house. I used to work at a museum that was once a functional prison. Throughout my 8+ years working there, I've been pushed, slapped, bit, dragged, and punched by unseen entities. I always had problems when I went to lock up certain buildings at night because you never knew what you would see coming around a corner. I went into the cell house once to turn off the lights, rounded the doorway to see a full-bodied apparition standing there in an inmate's uniform. A split second later, he vanished into thin air. There was a pretty notorious inmate who was involved in one of the riots, and his spirit would follow me around the grounds. One night, I was with a paranormal group, and we went into an area that we don't let the public visit because it's in disrepair, and we were screaming at to leave, and something snarled at me. It was not uncommon for me or one of my coworkers to have shadow people follow us around, and we would even have some poor visitors chased out of certain buildings like maximum security by such entities. I have dozens of stories about that place. Whenever I get sick, I get the same nightmare over and over. Background story. My room has a bed with a metal bed frame, and I'm a very messy person. Anyway, so when I get a cold or the flu, I get the same dream of a scary lady who seems to be in her 30s with very tangled black hair, fungus-covered skin, and glowing silver eyes sitting on my bed frame. I can't move, and she's just sitting and watching me for hours. She never moves, just sits there. Then towards the end, she becomes me, and I'm looking down at myself. Well, one time I was extremely sick, and all I could really do was sleep. So, one of the times I went to sleep, I woke up in the dream or in real life. I really don't know, and a gargoyle was sitting on my chest holding me down to where I could only use my eyes to look around. I was forced to look at my closet, which was very messy when I went to sleep, and it was exactly how I left it. The socks on the floor were exactly where I left them. The only difference was there was a 7 feet tall demon-like thing in my closet with yellow eyes, big claws, red wings with spikes, and a dragon-like head. It walked closer and closer to me until I wake up screaming. I told my dad about these days later, and he said he had the same dream years ago. It was creepy because we both described the demon the same way, and my mom confirmed that this was exactly how he described the demon years ago. The only difference was that in his dream the demon tried to drag him underground. I don't believe in the supernatural today, but I used to. Anyway, so there I was, a 7-year-old kid in rural Utah. I stayed the night at my grandparents' house on Main Street. I didn't want to sleep, so around midnight, I went down into the basement. I took my Matchbox card and played Night City with my glowing better blocks. I had this little metropolis going on when my uncle came down to play with me. Should I mention my great-uncle died when I was 2? Well, he did. Anyway, my great-uncle and I played Night City for a good hour. I remember it like it was yesterday. He drove the Lincoln because that was his favorite car. Anyway, it got late. He had to leave so he wouldn't miss his train. He left. I went to sleep. The next morning, I asked when Uncle was coming back to play again. My grandparents were slightly offended that I bought it up. They hadn't seen him since I was born and wanted nothing to do with him. He was the odd one out of the family. I said he and I played cars and showed them the car that he drove in our city. They were uncomfortable with this and chalked it up to my imagination. I never met my uncle. Again, he died when I was 2. Over the years since then, I have learned that he drove both a train for Union Pacific and a Lincoln MKVI. Like I said, I don't believe in ghosts, but I don't know how 7-year-old me knew things about an estranged relative who died when I was 2 and was never spoken of due to certain family issues. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I remember playing Night City with some guy who said he was my uncle like it was yesterday. He was super nice, and at the end of the game, simply left out the back door. I was in Yukon on a winter camping trip a couple of years after my mom died. We had a winter camp set up, but I wanted to sleep outside because it seemed adventurous and I'm good at making bad decisions. One night I woke up because it was too cold to sleep, minus 20 degrees, and I was lying in my bag shivering and thinking about my mom, and the northern lights started. I've seen the lights a few times before, but I'd never seen them like this. They went from north to south in waves, straight over my head, one after the other, just like waves hitting a beach. I watched for a minute, and then thought, wow, I bet everyone else would love to see this, so I got out of my bag and ran to the tent to wake people up. They sort of wasted time getting dressed and getting their lamps on and whatever, and I went back to my bag. By the time the others were dressed outside, the lights had faded. They stood around in the cold for a few minutes waiting for the lights to come back, but they got too cold and went back to bed. Immediately after their tent zipper closed, the lights came back on even more bright than before. I'm not religious and not especially spiritual, but Mom was very spiritual, and it was like a sign from Mother Nature, or whatever you want to call it, telling me I was okay, and that she was always with me. I went through the entire grieving cycle over the space of an hour or so that night. It completely changed my life. Can't explain it. Still brings tears to my eyes to think about it. I was really young. I would guess 8 to 10 years old, but that's just a ballpark guess. I shared a room with my younger brother. Our room was exceptionally large. And for some reason, we put our bunk beds right in the middle of the room, with the side of the bed facing the doorway. I had top bunk. Every morning, our mom would come into our room to wake us up for school. It was the worst feeling. This morning, I had already been awake for some time, just lying in bed. It was still dark outside. Depending on the time of year, I don't remember it being dark when we were getting up for school might have been normal. So, I'm sitting there lying in bed, and the door to our room opens. It doesn't take much effort to turn my gaze at the door. I see a woman in some kind of white gown, who I can only assume is my mother, even though I never recall her ever wearing an outfit like that, standing in the doorway. She takes a step in, closes the door behind her, and slowly starts approaching our beds. She gets so close that I'm no longer able to see her because of the angle I have being on the top bunk. I assume she's going to start waking up my brother at any moment. So I do that kid thing where I shut my eyes and pretend to be asleep. I wait, and wait, and wait. I finally open my eyes. The door is still closed. I'm super confused at this point, so I lean over the railing to see what she's up to. And there was no one there. I freak out and cover my head with all of my blankets and lay there for what felt like quite a bit until I fell asleep. I don't believe in ghosts. I'm sure there's a completely rational explanation for this. Maybe it was my mom, and I just didn't hear her open and close the door to leave again. Maybe there was no one there at all, and I imagined the whole thing. I don't know. It's not a super interesting ghost story, but it's all I've got. It's the only weird story I have from my childhood that I can't explain today. I grew up in a house that had this creepy Indian bust of a head and shoulders, and it looked as stereotypical as you can imagine, but something was sinister about it. So, for years, my bedroom was just outside by this, and I swear that it would watch me all the time. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination, and it was real. One night, I saw it looking at me. I was coming in from the movies, and my parents were asleep. I saw this thing staring at me, its cold bronze looking not so much at me, but right into my very soul. It blinked, and its mouth moved. I froze, and I couldn't move, and I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare back at this hideous statue, looking at me till my body allowed me to move. I've never felt such malice and evil intended to radiate off of anything in my entire life. Some years later, my parents died, and my house was sold off, and I never found out what happened to that bust, but I rest a little easier knowing that it was hopefully destroyed and rotting in some landfill. This happened to me when I was 9, 2010. My friend in the neighborhood found a Ouija board in his brother's stuff while he was away at college. He told me what it was and asked me if I wanted to play it with him. Trying to impress him, I said yes, and we went into his room and we tried it out. Nothing happened, and we were disappointed. Later that week, he called me and told me that he looked up how to use the board properly and wanted to give it another go. I agreed, as I was more confident that nothing would happen. So, we grabbed a bunch of scented candles, and we placed them around the board and did the whole seance stuff. We asked the board if anyone was there, and it of course went to yes. We thought the other was messing around, but we agreed to take it seriously because I didn't really care if it was a stupid joke. We asked the ghost what its name was, and it spelled out Owen. My friend asked if it was a person, and it went to no. We asked what it was, and it spelled out demon. I then asked them to prove it. You know that call in the intro to Finding Bigfoot? Well, that's the closest thing to what we heard from the garage. Keep in mind, it was only us in the house. It scared us, and we ran out of the house. We checked the garage, nothing. Anyway, a few weeks go by, and he tells me how he is having paranormal experiences. He feels like he is being watched whenever he is downstairs in the kitchen and living room. He feels someone sitting at the end of his bed every night. Every time he walks past the garage, he feels someone grabbing his wrist and pulling it towards the garage. Whenever I went over, I always got the feeling that someone was looking at me from the ceiling. It was defiantly unnatural. Then came the scariest part of all. We were at his house playing Army in his room, while no one else was home, when we began to hear heavy footsteps downstairs, except whatever was making it had hooves. It sounded like a full-grown horse was walking around downstairs. Then we heard someone begin to laugh and cough at the same time. My friend ran over and slammed the door shut, and we hid. He hid under his bed while I hid in his closet. Then it sounded like someone began scratching his door with one big claw, like the ones raptors had on their big toe. He He started crying, and I was on the verge of tears. My friend yelled, "Leave us alone, Owen. You're scaring us." It began to stop, and then we heard it run down the stairs. My friend got up and threw me out of the closet and grabbed the Ouija board that was in there with me. He ran down the stairs, ripped the screen door off of his gas fireplace, threw the thing in there, put the screen back on, and went to turn it on. When he was about to turn it on, we heard a loud moan from the basement, which was right behind my friend. He flicked the fireplace on, and the board began to burn. That was the end of that, and we played outside since he was too scared to go back into the house until his parents got home. His parents came home and saw that he burned his brother's Ouija board. They grounded him and threw the burned board away. That was the end of the paranormal experiences in my friend's house. And that's why I will never take part in one of those games again.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.